The year is 1700, in the heart of the suffocating, incense-choked Royal Alcázar of Madrid. Here, in a kingdom of shadows and whispers, a man who is also an empire is dying. His name is Charles II, King of Spain, Naples, Sicily, and the Indies. But these titles are a grotesque mockery of the creature trapped within the royal bedsheets. He is 38 years old but has the body of an ancient, decrepit man, his mind a clouded ruin. For years, the greatest theologians and exorcists of the realm have battled for his soul, convinced he is not merely sick but bewitched, a vessel for demonic forces. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But what if the demon was not a spirit from hell, but a ghost in his very blood? And now please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to continue making videos like this every day, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. To comprehend the tragedy of Charles II, one cannot begin with his birth, but with the centuries of choices that made his existence a biological inevitability, a final, agonizing gasp of a dynasty that had systematically poisoned its own wellspring of life for the sake of power. We must journey back into the heart of the House of Habsburg, a family that rose from a minor Swiss county to control a global empire through a simple, ruthlessly effective strategy. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. For generations, the Habsburgs did not conquer territories with armies, so much as they absorbed them through marriage contracts, their children becoming the living currency of geopolitical ambition. This policy created a sprawling, pan-European network of power, wedding Spanish kings to Austrian archduchesses and Portuguese infantas to Holy Roman emperors, until their family tree ceased to branch outwards and instead began to curve back upon itself, its roots and limbs tangling into a dense, inescapable knot. The physical manifestation of this policy was the infamous Habsburg jaw, the pronounced mandibular prognathism that became a badge of their royal lineage. Yet, this prominent chin was merely the most visible symptom of a far deeper, more insidious corruption, a slow-acting poison passed down in the blood, a genetic legacy that grew more concentrated, more potent, and more destructive with each successive, politically expedient union. The empire they built was vast, but the genetic pool from which they drew its future rulers became perilously, catastrophically small, a gilded cage of their own making. The story of this genetic decay is a chilling exercise in mathematics and human tragedy, a chronicle of a bloodline folding in on itself until it could no longer sustain life. The immediate ancestors of Charles II present a family tree that resembles less a tree than a closed loop, a serpent devouring its own tail. His father, Philip IV, was the product of a first-cousin marriage. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was not only Philip IV's niece but also the daughter of another first-cousin marriage within the same Habsburg line, making her his double first cousin once removed. This meant that Charles's parents were more closely related than most uncles and nieces. When geneticists calculate the coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of the probability that two alleles at any given locus are identical by descent, the results for Charles are staggering. A typical person's coefficient is 0. The offspring of a first-cousin marriage have a coefficient of 6.25%. The offspring of an uncle-niece pairing have a coefficient of 12.5%. Charles II of Spain had a coefficient of over 25%, a figure identical to that of a child born from the union of a parent and child, or a brother and sister. He had only 4 great-grandparents instead of the usual 8, and only 6 great-great-grandparents instead of the usual 16. His entire genetic heritage was drawn from an astonishingly shallow pool, where recessive, deleterious genes, normally diluted and masked in a wider population, were instead amplified, expressed, and made manifest with devastating consequences. The dynasty had sought to preserve its purity and its power, but in doing so, it had engineered its own extinction, creating in Charles a living testament to the biological price of their hubris, a king who was, in essence, the sum of his family's sins. The specific union that would seal the fate of the Spanish Habsburgs was that between the aging King Philip IV and his vibrant young niece, Mariana of Austria. Philip was a man steeped in the melancholic grandeur of his decaying empire, a monarch who had presided over military defeats and the slow erosion of Spanish power. He was haunted by personal loss, particularly the death of his beloved son and heir, Balthazar Charles, whose passing had plunged the king into a profound depression and created a succession crisis that threatened the stability of the entire Spanish world. The need for another male heir was not merely a personal desire but a state emergency. The solution, as always for the Habsburgs, was found within the family. Mariana of Austria, the daughter of Philip's sister, Maria Anna of Spain, had originally been betrothed to her cousin, the late Balthazar Charles. With his death, the political calculus was grimly reconfigured, and it was decided that the 17-year-old Mariana would instead marry her 44-year-old uncle, the grieving King Philip. Imagine the scene: a young woman, raised in the pious and rigid court of Vienna, being transported to the even more somber and ritualistic court of Madrid, to be wedded to a man old enough to be her father, a man who was also her mother's brother. Her duty was singular and stark: to provide a male heir and save the dynasty. The weight of this expectation fell upon her shoulders, a burden that would be compounded by a series of miscarriages and infant deaths, each loss deepening the gloom that pervaded the Alcázar and heightening the desperation for a healthy son. This was the atmosphere, thick with anxiety and fervent prayer, into which the last Spanish Habsburg would be born. On the 6th of November, 1661, after years of failed pregnancies and devastating losses, Queen Mariana finally gave birth to a son. The bells of Madrid pealed in celebration, and a wave of profound relief washed over the court and the kingdom. An heir had been born. The line was secure. Yet, this relief was immediately tempered by a deep and pervasive anxiety, for the infant prince, christened Carlos, was a fragile and unsettling sight. He was born with the severe Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he would struggle to close his mouth or chew his food for his entire life. His head was unusually large for his small, sickly body, and he was afflicted with a host of ailments from his very first breath. The foreign ambassadors in Madrid sent cautious, coded reports back to their own courts, noting the prince's weakness and the palpable fear that surrounded him. He was the hope of Spain, but he was a hope wrapped in infirmity. The court's response was not one of scientific inquiry but of smothering piety and desperate superstition. He was swaddled in relics, prayed over constantly, and shielded from every conceivable draught, noise, or disturbance. His survival was seen as a daily miracle, a testament to God's favor rather than a struggle against a flawed genetic inheritance. Every cough, every fever, sent ripples of panic through the palace. This was not the robust upbringing of a future ruler but the frantic preservation of a priceless, yet deeply flawed artifact. The boy was less a person than a symbol, a fragile vessel containing the future of a global empire, and from his first moments, it was clear that the vessel was cracked. The gilded cage that was the Royal Alcázar of Madrid became Charles's entire world, a world that sought to protect him so intensely that it ultimately crippled him. His physical development was alarmingly slow. He did not walk until he was nearly 4 years old and was not weaned from his wet nurses until the age of 5 or 6, long past the age when any other child would have been eating solid food, a task made nearly impossible by his severe prognathism. His speech was similarly delayed, and when he did begin to talk, it was with a lisp and a thick tongue that made him difficult to understand. Fearing for his fragile health, his mother and his caregivers enforced a regime of extreme indolence. He was forbidden from strenuous activity, which in his case meant almost any activity at all. While other princes were being rigorously trained in horsemanship, fencing, and the arts of war and statecraft, Charles was often confined to his chambers, playing with simple toys or observing the elaborate religious ceremonies that were the lifeblood of the court. This protective coddling had a catastrophic effect on his mental and social development. Denied the normal challenges and stimuli of childhood, his mind remained as underdeveloped as his body. He was treated as a sacred object, an idol to be venerated and preserved, not a boy to be raised or a king to be educated. His existence was a passive one, a life lived in the shadows of his own palace, surrounded by attendants who catered to his every whim but challenged him with nothing, creating a future king who would have the authority of a god, but the intellect and emotional maturity of a chronically ill child. When Charles was just shy of his 4th birthday, his father, the weary King Philip IV, finally succumbed to his own illnesses and died. In his will, Philip, acutely aware of his son's frailty, established a regency council to govern in Charles's name, with Queen Mariana at its head. The power of the vast Spanish Empire, with its territories in Italy, the Netherlands, the Americas, and the Philippines, now rested in the hands of a grieving widow and a committee of aristocrats, all acting on behalf of a toddler king who could not yet properly walk or speak. Queen Mariana, a woman of deep piety but limited political experience, found herself at the center of a vortex of courtly intrigue. She leaned heavily on her chosen confidant and advisor, an Austrian Jesuit priest named Juan Everardo Nithard, whom she appointed as the Grand Inquisitor. This appointment infuriated the Spanish grandees, who saw the Austrian priest as a foreign interloper, usurping their rightful influence. The court immediately fractured into competing factions, each vying for the Queen Regent's favor and seeking to control the levers of power. The atmosphere grew thick with paranoia and conspiracy. All of this political maneuvering, these bitter rivalries and power struggles, swirled around the silent, unknowing figure of the young king. He was the ultimate source of all authority, yet he was a complete non-entity in his own government, a living crown placed upon an empty throne, his profound weakness creating a vacuum that ambitious men would fight viciously to fill for the next decade and a half. The most significant threat to Queen Mariana's regency came not from a foreign power, but from within the Habsburg family itself, in the form of Don Juan José of Austria. He was the illegitimate but officially recognized son of Philip IV from an affair with an actress, and he was everything the young King Charles was not: handsome, intelligent, charismatic, and a proven military leader. He was immensely popular with the common people and the soldiers, who saw in him a reflection of Spain's past glory. Don Juan José viewed the Queen Regent and her Jesuit advisor, Nithard, with contempt, believing they were mismanaging the kingdom and isolating the young king. He saw himself as the rightful guardian of his half-brother and the true protector of the Spanish state. This set the stage for a protracted and bitter power struggle that defined Charles's youth. Don Juan José launched a public campaign against Nithard, forcing the Queen Regent to eventually dismiss her favorite and send him into exile. But this was only the first move. As Charles grew older, Don Juan José continued to position himself as the alternative to the weak and ineffective regency, culminating in a dramatic march on Madrid in 1677. He seized power, exiled Queen Mariana to a convent in Toledo, and effectively became the prime minister, ruling Spain in the name of his profoundly disabled half-brother. The reign of King Charles II thus began not with his own assertion of power, but with a palace coup that demonstrated to all of Europe just how powerless he truly was. As Charles transitioned from childhood into adolescence, the full extent of his cognitive and educational deficiencies became horrifyingly apparent and impossible to conceal. The task of educating the King of Spain, a role that should have been the most prestigious tutelage in the kingdom, became a source of profound frustration and despair. Tutors were appointed, learned men charged with molding the royal mind, but they found themselves facing an insurmountable obstacle. Charles possessed an extremely short attention span and a near-total inability to grasp abstract concepts. He struggled to read and write even the simplest of sentences well into his teenage years. The complex histories of his own family, the intricate details of his global empire, the foundational principles of law and governance, all of it was utterly beyond his comprehension. His mind, dulled by a lifetime of illness and a lack of stimulation, simply could not retain the information. Reports from his tutors speak of a young man who was placid and docile, but intellectually inert. He showed little curiosity about the world beyond his immediate surroundings and seemed content to spend his days in simple pastimes, such as playing with his dogs or observing religious processions from a palace window. This was not merely a matter of being a poor student, it was a fundamental incapacity. The monarch who held absolute power over millions of souls across the globe could not compose a coherent letter or follow a basic line of reasoning. The immense and complex machinery of the Spanish state had at its heart a profound and terrifying emptiness, a king who could reign but could not rule. With Charles having reached his majority, at least in name, the most pressing matter of state was securing the succession through marriage. A king's primary duty was to produce an heir, and for Charles, this duty was paramount, as his death without a direct descendant would plunge the Spanish Empire, and likely all of Europe, into a catastrophic war. The chosen bride was Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the vibrant and beautiful 17-year-old niece of the powerful King Louis XIV of France. The marriage was a political masterstroke, intended to soothe the long-standing rivalry between the Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties. For the young Marie-Louise, however, it was a sentence to a life of gloom and duty. Ripped from the famously lively and sophisticated French court at Versailles, she was thrust into the rigid, somber, and intensely religious world of the Spanish Alcázar. Her arrival was like a splash of brilliant color in a monochrome landscape. She was charming, intelligent, and full of life, a stark and tragic contrast to her new husband. Charles, then 18, was immediately and deeply infatuated with his beautiful young wife. He developed a childlike, dependent affection for her, following her around the palace and showering her with a pathetic, desperate love. For a brief time, it seemed that Marie-Louise's vivacity might awaken some spark in the sullen king. She tried to engage him, to draw him out of his shell, and to bring a semblance of joy into his suffocating life. But the hope she represented was fragile, destined to be crushed by the central, unavoidable tragedy of their union. The royal marriage, which had begun with a flicker of pathetic hope, soon descended into a national crisis and a private agony. The one thing the kingdom demanded of them, an heir, they could not produce. The failure, it was clear to all, lay with the king. Charles, plagued by a host of genetic defects, was almost certainly sterile. Modern medical analysis suggests he may have suffered from a combination of conditions, including pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, which would have rendered him impotent or infertile. The immense pressure on the royal couple was unbearable. The court, the church, and the people waited with bated breath for any news of a royal pregnancy. Every month that passed without an announcement deepened the crisis. Public prayers were held, and humiliating religious and folk remedies were prescribed. The queen was subjected to invasive examinations and bizarre fertility rituals, while the king was plied with supposed aphrodisiacs. For Marie-Louise, life in the Spanish court became a living hell. She was blamed by the pro-Austrian faction for her failure to conceive, whispered about by courtiers, and watched constantly. Her youthful joy slowly evaporated, replaced by a profound melancholy. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, tied to a man she could pity but not love. Her own future and happiness sacrificed for a dynastic purpose she was unable to fulfill. The tragedy was twofold: the political crisis of a king without an heir, and the deep, personal despair of a man and a woman trapped in a fruitless union, their bedroom the focal point of an entire empire's anxiety. After a decade of a barren marriage, the fragile hope that Marie-Louise represented was extinguished forever. In February of 1689, the queen, still only 26 years old, fell violently ill with what was described as an inflammation of her internal organs, possibly appendicitis or peritonitis. After a short and agonizing sickness, she died. Charles was plunged into a state of absolute and inconsolable grief. He had loved his wife with a desperate, childlike devotion, and her death shattered what little stability he possessed. While the official cause of death was illness, the fetid atmosphere of the Spanish court immediately gave rise to sinister rumors. The pro-Austrian faction at court, led by the formidable Queen Mother Mariana, had long resented the French queen's influence and blamed her for the succession crisis. Whispers of poison spread like wildfire. Was she eliminated to make way for a new, hopefully more fertile, German bride who would align Spain with the Holy Roman Empire? While no definitive proof of assassination has ever been found, the suspicion alone speaks volumes about the toxic political climate. For Charles, the loss was catastrophic. He reportedly returned again and again to her tomb, demanding that the casket be opened so he could gaze upon her decaying face one last time. Her death marked a significant turning point in his life, the moment when his profound melancholy began to curdle into something far darker, a descent into physical and mental ruin from which he would never recover, and the point at which the court's search for a rational explanation for his condition began to give way to a more terrifying, supernatural one. The political machinery of the Spanish court did not allow for a prolonged period of mourning. An heir was more critical than ever, and a new queen had to be found immediately. With the French connection severed by Marie-Louise's death, the powerful pro-Austrian faction, now with the tacit support of the grieving king's mother, moved swiftly to secure a German alliance. The choice fell upon Maria Anna of Neuburg, a princess from a large and famously fertile German family, whose sisters were married into the royal houses of Portugal and the Holy Roman Empire. Maria Anna could not have been more different from her predecessor. Where Marie-Louise had been charming and gentle, Maria Anna was politically ambitious, domineering, and overtly pro-Austrian. She arrived in Spain not as a frightened young bride, but as a political operative with a clear agenda: to produce a Habsburg heir who would secure the Spanish throne for the Austrian branch of the family, and to enrich her own German relatives. For Charles, now slipping deeper into depression and ill health, this second marriage was devoid of the affection that had characterized his first. It was a transaction of grim duty. He was a passive participant in his own life, a pawn being moved across the chessboard by his mother and his new, calculating wife. The relationship was cold and fraught with tension. Maria Anna, upon realizing the true extent of her husband's infirmities and his likely infertility, grew to despise him, her initial ambition curdling into bitter frustration as she, too, failed to conceive. The second marriage was as fruitless as the first, but it was marked by a new level of desperation and deceit. Queen Maria Anna, facing the same existential threat as her predecessor, the loss of status and influence that came with being a barren queen, resorted to extreme measures. On multiple occasions, she orchestrated elaborate deceptions, claiming to be pregnant. These phantom pregnancies, known as cloquios in Spanish, were political theater of the highest order. The court would be officially informed, celebrations planned, and for a few months, the queen's position would be secure as the kingdom awaited the birth of an heir. But inevitably, the charade would collapse. A miscarriage would be announced, or the date of delivery would pass with no issue, plunging the court back into crisis and further eroding the queen's credibility. It was during this period of mounting failure and despair that the narrative surrounding King Charles began its definitive shift from the medical to the metaphysical. Faced with a king whose body was wasting away, whose mind was clouded, and whose seed was barren, the court and the country began to abandon rational explanations. It was no longer enough to say he was sick. The scale of his afflictions, the totality of his failure as a man and a king, seemed to demand a grander, more sinister explanation. The seed of an idea, planted in the fertile ground of Spanish piety and superstition, began to sprout. The king was not just ill, he was cursed. He was El Hechizado, the Bewitched. As Charles staggered into his 30s, his body became a grotesque tableau of his genetic inheritance, a walking, breathing monument to dynastic decay. The catalogue of his ailments was extensive and horrifying, a daily litany of suffering that transformed the king into a prisoner within his own skin. The prominent Habsburg jaw, which had plagued him since birth, had caused his few remaining teeth to rot and fall out, making mastication a torturous process and leaving him to subsist on a diet of soft, mashed foods, which he often swallowed whole. This, combined with what was likely a chronically inflamed digestive system, the infamous Habsburg stomach, led to constant indigestion, vomiting, and diarrhea. His body was racked by seizures, the epileptic fits growing more frequent and violent with age, often leaving him senseless for hours. His limbs and face would swell with edema, his skin stretched taut over bloated flesh, only for the fluid to recede, leaving him looking even more gaunt and skeletal than before. He aged prematurely, so that by his mid-30s he appeared to be an old man, his hair white, his back bent, his movements slow and shuffling. He was a king whose physical presence inspired not awe, but pity and revulsion. His body had become a battlefield where a war against his own corrupted biology was being waged and lost, each new symptom another fortress falling, another province of his physical self surrendering to the relentless siege of his own blood. It was this corporeal horror, this visible disintegration of the royal person, that made the idea of witchcraft seem not only plausible but logical to a 17th century mind. With medical science offering no cure and the king's condition worsening daily, the Spanish state, in an act of profound desperation, turned to the only other power it believed could intervene: The Church. The theory that Charles was bewitched, once a fringe whisper, now became the official diagnosis of the court, championed by influential figures including the Queen herself, who may have seen it as a way to deflect blame from her own failure to produce an heir. The matter was taken up by the highest religious authority in the land, the Spanish Inquisition. The Grand Inquisitor, Cardinal Rocaberti, sanctioned a formal investigation and a course of action. This was not to be a quiet series of prayers, but a full-blown, state-sponsored exorcism of the King of Spain. A team of the most renowned exorcists in the kingdom was assembled, led by a formidable Capuchin friar named Mauro Tenda. They descended upon the royal chambers, transforming the sick room of the king into a theater of spiritual warfare. Charles, weak in body and mind, was subjected to a terrifying and bizarre ordeal. He was forced to drink holy water mixed with blessed earth and consecrated oils, vile concoctions designed to purge the demonic influence. Relics of saints were placed on his bloated body, and the air in his chambers grew thick with the smoke of incense and the ceaseless chanting of Latin rites, prayers, and commands, all aimed at expelling the demons they believed were nested deep within the royal flesh, twisting his organs, clouding his mind, and stealing his vitality. The exorcisms were not a single event, but a prolonged campaign of psychological and spiritual torment that stretched on for months. The exorcists, led by the zealous Friar Tenda, employed methods of intense interrogation, believing that the demon or demons possessing the king could be forced to reveal their names and the nature of the curse. Under this immense pressure, Charles, a man whose will was already eroded by a lifetime of illness and passivity, began to break. He was highly suggestible, his mind a canvas onto which the exorcists could paint their own terrifying conclusions. In the dim light of his chamber, surrounded by grim-faced priests, he began to confess. He spoke of feeling a demonic presence within him, a dark force that had plagued him since childhood. He claimed that the spell had been cast upon him when he was 14 through a cup of chocolate, and that its purpose was to render him impotent and destroy his line. He even named the supposed spirit possessing him as a demon named Maccabeo. Whether these were genuine delusions, hallucinations brought on by his illnesses, or simply the desperate answers of a terrified man telling his tormentors what they so clearly wanted to hear, we will never know. But for the exorcists, it was proof. The King of Spain had admitted his own possession. The diagnosis was confirmed from the victim's own mouth, and the Kingdom of Spain was now officially ruled by a man believed to be a vessel for hell itself. As the 17th century drew to its agonizing close, the spectacle within the Madrid Alcázar reached its final, macabre act. The king was a living ghost, a shuffling, vacant-eyed wreck who now rarely left his chambers. The exorcisms had failed to cure him. They had only shattered his remaining sanity. He was prone to fits of rage, followed by long periods of catatonic stupor. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the great powers of Europe were no longer waiting politely for his demise. They were actively preparing for it. Diplomats from France, Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic engaged in a frantic, ghoulish dance, negotiating secret partition treaties to carve up the vast Spanish Empire upon Charles's death. They drew lines on maps, dividing Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and the lucrative American colonies among themselves, all without the consent or knowledge of the Spanish government. They treated the empire as a carcass to be butchered, a reflection of how they viewed its dying king. The central question that consumed every court in Europe was, who would inherit the throne? The two main claimants were the House of Bourbon, represented by Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, and the House of Habsburg, represented by the Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The court in Madrid was viciously divided into pro-French and pro-Austrian factions, each applying relentless pressure on the dying king's counselors. Understanding that the fate of the continent rested on the final testament of a man whose mind was a ruin. The end came in the autumn of 1700. Charles's condition deteriorated rapidly. The edema became so severe that his entire body was swollen and misshapen, a condition the court physicians called hydropessia. His breathing became a shallow, rattling struggle. In his few lucid moments, he was tormented by morbid obsessions. In one infamous episode, he demanded that the tombs of his ancestors in the royal crypt at El Escorial be opened. He gazed upon the decomposing remains of his father, his mother, and most poignantly, his first wife, Marie-Louise, whose body was said to be remarkably preserved. This final, ghoulish family reunion seemed to break what was left of his spirit. He returned to Madrid to die. In his final days, the political struggle over his will reached a fever pitch. Cardinal Portocarrero, the head of the pro-French faction, gained control of the king's chambers. He convinced the dying monarch and the Council of State that only a French successor could command the military power necessary to keep the Spanish Empire intact and prevent its partition by foreign powers. On the 3rd of October, the king, barely conscious, allegedly signed the will that had been prepared for him. For weeks he lingered, his body finally shutting down. On the 1st of November, 1700, at the age of 38, King Charles II of Spain died. The suffering of El Hechizado was finally over, but the suffering he would bequeath to Europe was just beginning. A week after the king's death, the Council of State gathered in the palace, and the royal will was unsealed and read aloud. The assembled courtiers, especially those of the pro-Austrian faction led by the now widowed Queen Maria Anna, listened with breathless tension. The will was unequivocal. It bypassed the Austrian Habsburg line entirely and named as the sole and universal heir to the entire undivided Spanish Empire, Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second grandson of King Louis XIV of France. The shock was seismic. The will stipulated that if Philip refused, the crown would pass to his younger brother, and if he too refused, only then would it pass to the Austrian Archduke Charles. It was a complete and total victory for the French faction and for Louis XIV, the lifelong rival of the Spanish Habsburgs. When the news reached Versailles, Louis famously presented his grandson to the court with the declaration, "Gentlemen, behold the King of Spain." A courtier was said to have remarked, "Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées," there are no more Pyrenees, a phrase that captured the terrifying new reality for the rest of Europe, a potential union of the French and Spanish crowns, creating a Catholic superpower that would dominate the continent. The Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna was enraged and refused to accept the will. England and the Dutch Republic, fearing the disruption to the balance of power, prepared for war. The death of one broken man had ignited the fuse for the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would rage for 13 years and cause the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The final chapter in the story of Charles II was written not on the battlefield, but on the autopsy table. The physicians who had been powerless to help him in life were now tasked with cataloging the ruin of his body. Their report is a chilling document, a testament to the catastrophic effects of generations of inbreeding. They found, they wrote, that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. While the anatomical descriptions are undoubtedly colored by the medical language of the time, the picture they paint is one of systemic organ failure on a horrifying scale. His body was a wasteland, the physical manifestation of a genetic dead end. His tragic life serves as a profound and unsettling historical lesson. Charles II was a king who ruled a global empire but possessed no sovereignty over his own body or mind. He was the living, suffering embodiment of a dynasty's fatal flaw, a human sacrifice laid upon the altar of pure blood and political expediency. His story is a grotesque intersection of genetics, superstition, and geopolitics, where the arcane rituals of exorcism were used to combat the unyielding laws of heredity. In the end, they called him the Bewitched, but the curse was not supernatural. It was a legacy, passed down from one Habsburg to the next, a fatal inheritance that finally consumed the last of his line, leaving behind a vacant throne and a continent on the brink of war.